Good morning. Welcome to this Register webcast in association with Kaseya, where we're here to talk about IT management and how everyone can do it in exactly the same way as the very best, i.e. the service providers. And there may be some disagreement with that out there, and we'd be delighted to hear that. So give us all your stories of best practice and anything that you want to share, any questions that you have. I'm here to introduce our wonderful panel, who is, for a start, most importantly perhaps, Dr. Zafar Chaudry. Is that got the pronunciation right there? Yeah. Excellent. Who's CIO of Liverpool Women's and Older Age Children's Trust. Have I got that bit right as well? That's right. Yeah. Excellent. Doing well so far. So Dr. Zafar's got all the experience of how to run IT, and also to speak is Matt Chinnery from Kaseya, who's probably wanting to tell us that tools can make it all perfect, and you don't need any of that best practice or stuff because it's all perfectly automatic these days, isn't it, Matt? So and here to balance proceedings between practice and process and tools, we have our ever expert Tony Lock, who's also an ex-IT manager, who's from Freeform Dynamics, and who's going to take us through the background context research and what we can learn from you, the Register audience, through the various studies that Freeform Dynamics has run. So as we go through things, Tony's going to kick us off with the challenges presented by the research. But really what we're here to learn is how to take the best practices experienced by managed service providers, MSPs, and how they can map onto our IT departments. Because MSPs are commercial organisations and they have to run stuff efficiently and effectively, so otherwise they don't make any money. So it's kind of very practical reasons why that's necessary. But actually there's very practical reasons why that becomes less possible in real world non-MSP environments, and that's what Dr. Zafar is going to explain to us, and how to overcome those barriers, and of course, yes, where do the tools fit in. So without further ado, I'm going to hand straight over to you, Tony, to give us some background into this wonderful topic.
Thank you very much, John. And as ever, I've got hundreds of slides here that we've tried to condense down to a few, with just the feedback from the Register audience that we've picked up over many surveys, essentially over many years, looking at all the facets of systems management and service management as well, and how the two intermingle. And the first slide we have here essentially tells us that, well, on the face of it, when we asked people, how much do you agree with the statements we have down below here? You can see the second statement here is we think in terms of business services rather than individual systems, and almost 20% agree very, very strongly there. Whereas at the opposite end of the spectrum, we've got not quite as many saying that they don't. Now that, to a degree, is somewhat unusual, given that when we've asked essentially the same questions on other surveys, looking more at the technology level rather than at service management itself, we've had a much lower number of people saying that's the way IT works in our organisation. So I think there's been a bit of the usual self-selection that we get on a web survey here, and in essence over the years we've found very few organisations have really adopted this service management delivery approach for how they get their users in front of their systems working productively. I mean, no one's going to ever say they're making a complete hash of it, are they, in these surveys? No. But and indeed, when we've asked the businesses, is IT a big problem in your organisation, most of them are saying absolutely not. It's the least of our problems. So it's not all black, it's not all white, but in terms of working as a service delivery type organisation, it's still a relatively small number of organisations that work that way. And we can see again further down on the slide that the amount of automation that people have, which is clearly a prime requirement of that service delivery side of things, is very, very low.
I'm going to bring in Dr. Zafar very early here, if I may, and get you on the spot a little bit. Just around this word service, I mean, how important is it to you to kind of run a service setup rather than just doing the techie screwdriver stuff setup?
I think it's evolved. So probably about 5 years ago in the health service, for example, it wasn't about service. People within the team thought they were just part of the hospital, providing day-to-day fixes, desktops, PCs, laptops, servers. And as we've become more business focused in the health service, it's turned into we are service providers to the users. And the message we've been trying to give our own staff is, well, you actually have to be a service provider, because they could take that provision of service from somebody else, not your team. So it's evolving slowly and steadily. I think you've got to take a look at the people you've got. It's not about the technology really, it's about the people, and then looking at the process and then the technology, and that's the journey we've taken as an organisation, because having people in roles that they've been doing for many, many years has been really difficult to get them to change and adapt to being that mindset of customer service focused service provision.
Maybe there's the point. It's not so much about whether IT needs to be providing services, it's the fact that users of IT definitely want to receive services, so it's getting into that customer mindset.
And everybody wants service quickly.
Yeah, well, don't we all? We're all customers.
That's right,
But Tony, there are challenges, aren't there? How would you summarise those?
Absolutely, and as Dr. Chaudry just told us there, a lot of the challenges that the register audience have told us over the years have got some things to do with the technology itself, but a lot of them are very much on the people and process side. You can see the things that we've got here, operation staff overstretch, lots of conflicting priorities, continual demand for the new services delivered yesterday, supporting changes all of the time, delivering new services very rapidly, and underlying all of that, the management processes that people have in place. A lot of these feedback that we've got from the register audience, if you look at it, are down to that whole way that IT has grown up over the years of looking after the infrastructure rather than focusing on the service that was delivered by the infrastructure. And that's something that's slowly transforming, but it is slowly, and clearly some organisations are further ahead down that road than others.
The infrastructure is real, isn't it? At least, break fix. If it's broken, you can fix it. You know exactly what you're doing.
And I don't believe that users really care about that technology anymore. It's about getting that service. Can I get my internet connection? Can I get on my applications? They don't really want to worry about what's happening in the background anymore. Whereas 5 years ago, in our environment, people were concerned about desktops, laptops, servers, storage, but nobody cares about that anymore. It's can I get my apps when I need them?
What do you think, Matt? Are you seeing, if 0 is care totally and 100 is don't care in the slightest, where would you say your customers are?
Yeah, I think Zafar's right. There's definitely a kind of a need to have this service, to have, your applications, to be able to get on the internet, to be able to use email. You don't really mind what's going on in the background as long as that service is delivered and is always available when I need it. And I think that's a key point that needs to be sort of driven, is that you need to have this service there, definitely.
But we've been talking about services for years, haven't we? Because it's all been SLAs, Tony. It's
again,
service, isn't it?
Again, as you can see from the slides here, we've distilled several surveys that we've asked the register audience about over many years, and even today, the number of organisations that really do think in terms of business level, service level agreements are comparatively small. Even when it gets down to actually looking at the recognition of the services idea, the services philosophy, it's still by no means pervasive across businesses. It's something we've been talking about on webinars like this, but it takes time to change people. It takes time to change processes. People always think that changing IT is difficult and takes a long time. It's much harder to change people and process, and it's not only the IT side that's linked in here. There's also things to do with budgeting and approvals processes and stuff like that, where the business does get involved, and that needs to change as well.
So should we be moving away from SLAs, or are they still a part of what needs to happen, or are they just not the only thing? It's like the shield, isn't it? You've got an SLA, that should be enough for you.
We've discussed before, I think that there's a need for SLAs that mean something, both to IT, but more importantly to the business itself. And quite a lot of SLAs have been described in very technical terms, which the business doesn't really care about. We have, the system's going to be available for X percentage of the year, 99 point whatever. Do I really care if it's not available at the time when I want it, or if it's available notionally but running so slowly that I can't use it? So that's where service level agreements need to again evolve to become much more business focused.
Not just response times.
Yeah, people want a flexible, adaptable IT service. Service levels, yes, give you a benchmark definition, allow you to report into boards and executive teams as to what you are delivering, but from a user perspective, if In a hospital, if I've got a patient lying on an operating room table and my PC at the bedside isn't working, do I really care about service levels, priority 1s and 5s? No, I just want that system to work. So the service you provide has to adapt and make that work. And that's where there isn't a clear differentiation. And when you talk to your own IT staff about being service providers, they don't completely understand themselves beyond the hardware, the technology. They're not understanding what the business is doing. So you've got to mesh the two.
I guess this is where the MSP aspect comes in as well, because when you're just buying something, Matt.
Yeah, I think that's it's a very valid point, because now the IT department almost has to be a service provider to the organisation, and that I think has been highlighted already today. That's the way that IT departments need to sort of view their estate so that they can be more proactive. And we'll see as we go through this presentation how that can be used very effectively. But yes, I think there is definitely a need to sort of manage the SLAs, but also be that service provider to your sort of users.
My experience is a bit out of date, I confess, on this stuff. But back in the day when I actually did a proper job, I still had that pushback from the business that said that's IT's problem. So it was almost IT has both, yes, you're supposed to do it perfectly, but we're not going to tell you what we need. We're just going to say, well, that's technology, you need to deal with it. So you're between a rock and a hard place in some way.
I think that's changed, though, because the user of today in our environment is more empowered. They have more knowledge. They live in a world where they have 50 megabit connections into their homes. And they come to work now with the same level of expectations, and probably Apple has a lot to do with this, but people have that level of expectation, so they come into our enterprise and say, well, why isn't my internet connection that fast? Why can't I just connect to any application? Whereas 5 years ago, you're absolutely right, people would say, I don't know what I want. I can't sit down with you. But now they do sit down with you and they say, I want that Apple experience at work.
So it's not just increased expectations, it's also increased understanding. They need to have a dialogue.
Oh, absolutely, yes.
And they want to join that dialogue.
They do, but I think the requirements have skyrocketed. So exponential growth in what people want has gone from, yes, we understand this is a hospital and we get some bare minimum functionality, to looking at what they can get at home and saying, right, well, I want better than that. Because if I'm spending £399 at home for a tablet device, why are we spending millions at work and not getting a better experience than that?
Tony?
Yep, it's very much, again, in line with what we have on the slide here. Lots of organisations today don't have a clear picture of the infrastructure that they're running, never mind the services that they're delivering, and getting that dialogue with the organisation so that they can understand the services that the business really needs. Quite often users will ask for a whole bunch of services. Quite how business critical they are is often open to more than a little degree of interpretation. Some people claim that they absolutely have to have this for business reasons, whereas the reality is somewhat different. So getting a much better picture of the services being delivered, the services the business really needs, the ones that are optional, and then getting in place behind that, as we see on the right-hand side of the charts, ways of funding IT so that it can meet this service delivery approach. Because still, lots of organisations, lots of the readers out there tell us that they're funded very much project by project or silo by silo, and turning those silos into a service delivery platform, without, different ways of accounting for the use of things, different ways of potentially throttling people's usage where they're doing things inappropriately, and having them agree to that throttling has to be done by the business, because once IT starts throttling things on its own, it gets the blame even more than it always gets the blame anyway.
And as any parent of teenagers will know, that when the decision actually revolves around money and it's their money they're spending, people start to get a lot more focused on where that money should go. Whereas when it's it's just a big budget, it's someone else's purse, isn't it? It's Mickey Mouse a little bit. And
we have had the readers telling us that there are still in some organisations, more than a minority, where people still look on, we've paid for this amount of the IT infrastructure and we're the only people that want to be able to use that. Rather than creating these virtualized pools that anybody can use as one of the underlying platforms on which to build a service management approach. That's also something that needs to be gotten over. In some organisations it's not a problem, in others it's a big problem. So that whole way of accounting for the use of resources and getting people to finance things differently is something that's probably as much of a challenge, if not more of a challenge, than even making the technology changes.
So, going to open this up to the floor, really. That we've had some principles and best practices in place for what seems to me my entire career. Things like ITIL, they came in the 90s, etc., created by a whole bunch of very bright sparks. But is it wrong now to even think in ITIL terms, or is it still valid, or is it? Where would you see ITIL stand?
I think when you're building a adaptable service for your users, you have to be able to look at the principles of various best practice, ITIL just being one of those, and then adapt and mould those to your environment. Because when you look at the big methodologies like ITIL, you'd probably need a lot more staff than what most IT departments are running to effectively implement it from A to Z. So what we did in our environment was look at the ITIL fundamentals and say, well, what are the portions that make sense for us? What are the portions we could potentially implement, and what are the ones we can't because we don't have the resources? We don't have the sustainability post implementation. So we took bits from the ITIL best practice and tried to look at the processes we were actually using and seeing whether or not they were outdated. And most certainly they were, because that's the big problem. People don't re-engineer their business process before they want to become a service provider. And we looked at this pragmatically and said, well, I know my people don't want to change because they live in the server storage desktop world, so let's get them changed first, but at the same time ask them, well, why do you do what you do to get where you want to be? And in 9 cases out of 10, the staff initially struggled to define, well, why do we do it that way? And you take it and you knock it on its head and say, well, if we were to start with a blank sheet of paper, what would we do? What would you want the users to do to enable you to do what you should be doing? And that was all the process we went through long before we even thought about, well, are there any tools that can enable us to do that? So you pick pieces from the various methodologies and mould them to your environment. So we're a relatively small team. There's only 24 technical people across the 2 trusts. But when you sort of grow that into bigger district generals or private sector organisations where they have hundreds of IT staff, the way in which they will adopt best practice will be very different than the way in which we do.
I've got a question here. Is ITIL too rigid for the cloud? But I guess we could expand that to say, is ITIL too rigid?
I believe it is.
Well, again, it depends on how you look at ITIL, because ITIL was again set up originally to be more of exactly the way that Dr. Chaudry has described things. To be, take what's pragmatic for you to do and adapt it and get the process in place, rather than you have to do life, the universe and everything according to this guidebook. It was all about getting best practice and process, rather than being a rigid framework that some of the large consultancies have tried to turn it into.
I think it is about process rather than anything more, about having a process and understanding how that process works and adapting it to fit what you need. I don't think some of our MSP customers would necessarily all conform to ITIL best practices rigidly 100%. So I think it's about adapting it to fit your needs as well, definitely.
That pragmatism is really fundamental, and it's an extremely important point.
And thinking about the MSP side of things, Matt, maybe are they using ITIL? Or?
Again, it's in most cases it's definitely a pick and choose. I mean, you'll see from the slide that we've got there that it's about getting what you need from the delivery method that you're trying to adopt. So, there may be certain processes in place, to allow the flow of how things go through the business organically. But to answer your question, I don't think that all of our MSPs are using every bit of ITIL. I think it's definitely what's right for them at that moment. Because also, you look at it from an MSP perspective, they're also dealing with a lot of organisations that obviously have potentially their own processes in place within the company. So it's about adapting that to fit everybody, if you like. So I think really the unanimous thought is use the bits you need and map that to what you need it to do.
Well, if you're going to be rigid, you're creating another problem.
Definitely.
Which is, yeah.
And rigidity, as we know, and as Dr. Chaudry said, people want flexibility anyway. Almost at a sort of subconscious level, if not at a technology level. It's become a technology issue, but it's really about people need to be able to change, much more quickly than in the past. So making anything rigid, whether it's an IT work process or a business process, doesn't work. You need to have that flexibility to change it when you need to change it. When it shouldn't change, then you've got to have the rigidity, enough rigidity in there to keep things working the way they should do. But it needs to have flexibility of an appropriate degree built in.
So let's have a look at this list then. Do more with less. Yeah, automation. We'll come to that.
Definitely.
Proactive, absolutely ongoing. Defined processes we've covered to an extent. Defined bundle of services. What's that all about?
Well, I think that's kind of just making sure that when you deliver the service as a whole, there are defined. I don't mean to put silos as a word, but defined areas within the service. You've got your email service, you've got your internet service, and about allowing the whole sort of IT department to understand how it all fits together. I think it's good that everyone knows the vision.
I think it also comes down to actually having a service catalogue that people can pick from.
Yes.
Because if you just say that people can do whatever they like, then you end up with anarchy. The one thing I think that you went over really quickly there was the proactive side, and I think that's something that in IT we've traditionally been very reactive, and it took me a lot of persuasion by my then boss to become much more proactive in terms of communicating with the customers, as the training courses forced me to call them rather than users, to get them to understand what IT potentially could do from them and what did they need. So that whole, being more upfront and conversing, communicating with people proactively rather than just reactively either defending what's happened or explaining what's happened is something that's really important on here.
I think from that slide that the proactive message goes a lot further, because with sort of the cassaya tool as well, you can actually bring in quite a lot of proactive measures to actually your service delivery. You can have things happen and work in the background once they're sort of set up and are scheduled to run. Then those go away, if you like. You can set your backups to run weekly through Kaseya, one place, and everything's going to run seamlessly from then on. Yes, you get reporting, yes, you get alerts, but it's about being able to do more with less, to set these things up and allow them to run smoothly.
We'll come back to the tools.
I'm sure
Matt,
we will, but
many times. But just a quick question for you, Dr. Zafar. Saying no, how much of that is a requirement in your job?
Well, I think you can't say no, because when you're a service provider and you're competing to keep the service provision in-house versus out of house, how can you say no when the environment is always changing? What you've got to do is build a service that takes the noise in the organisation and makes some sense out of that noise and channel it and funnel it through your service delivery team, where people are getting realistic expectations for what you can deliver with timelines and timeframes. What people don't want to do is sit in a room. You're sitting in a room with consultants and you say no, all you will get is escalation to executive teams and boards because you're not cooperative. What you need to be doing is saying, yes, we can do that for you, but this is how it will fit within the project timescales, within the service delivery timescales. And once they have the assurance that you actually do know that you've got that under control, the noise goes away. So I think you've got to find that balance between, yes, you should be saying no when you're overwhelmed with the amount of work you might have, but no always comes across as a negative answer. So you've got to take that and flip it and say, well, how do we proactively convert that into something that people can understand?
It's one of those, you can have anything you want, but you can't have everything you want all at the
That's
same
right.
time.
And when do you want it? How soon do you want it? And these are the prerequisites we have to do before you actually get it.
I think it also comes down to understanding the consequences of what you're asking for, whether it be in terms of costs or timescales, but also potentially sometimes people ask for things that they shouldn't be doing, and then it's a case of getting the business to say, no, you cannot do that. You cannot send this, patient data unencrypted, on the internet to someone somewhere else for whatever reason. It might be a good reason for it, but you've got the whole security side in there as well. So, and in every business there are things that you shouldn't do, but it's not really IT's job to say no, don't do that. But unfortunately, in lots of organisations, security and enforcement of security has been pushed onto IT because the business doesn't want to do it and doesn't understand it. And that's something where getting the business to say no in exactly the same way with the priorities, rather than IT saying no, so that the business decides what order to do things in.
I have a question that's come up here. It's how detailed should we get when defining services? So is there a line, or how does it work?
I think you have to have a framework. I think when you get too detailed, then it becomes very to the book, and people don't like their own service provider to be always focusing on that service level. So you have to give a framework, and the framework will be adaptable based on the business units within your business, but you then have to take a look at how that changes, because it will change. A service level, we've written service levels with our business units, and they're very generalised across what they would want as a global service, and every quarter we're constantly changing that service level as we learn from the previous quarter in terms of what people wanted and what people didn't want. So you could spend a lot of time and a lot of consultancy money writing 60, 70, 80 page documents which are probably not worth the paper it's printed on, or you can sit down with your users and say, generally, what kind of service do we want? What are the key priority levels? And then let's monitor. It's all about monitoring that, isn't it?
Yep.
Because it's easy for me to say, I will fix something in 4 hours. And I can generate a report at the end of the month to say, yes, I actually achieved that. But the question isn't, had you achieved the service level? The question is, was the user satisfied by the provision of service we gave them within that 4 hours? And that could never be defined in a standard service level.
Pragmatism. So you need enough, but not too much.
That's pragmatism.
Absolutely.
Never have too much pragmatism. That's always good.
But it's something that, again, once you start trying to put in too much in the way of process, it can become rigid on its own. So it's, scales and balances here.
I guess another question is, can you have too many tools?
Absolutely. As you can see from the chart here, when we've asked people when it comes to doing the management that we need, do you have an holistic vision of everything that you're doing, or are you running lots of different technologies? And the answer far and away is that we're running lots of different technologies. Lots and lots and lots of different technologies. In some of the larger companies, if there's one of them out there, we've got 3 of them, never mind one, and each of them used slightly differently. So lots of potential for things to get lost, the needs for training and skills to go up to actually keep all of this being flown, as we can see from the slide here. What challenges come from this? Just basically things falling through the gaps, paying too much money because we're paying multiple vendors for multiple tools, a lot of which are overlapping, and we're spending a lot of time trying to integrate them. And frankly, in systems management these days, a lot of that integration comes down to people doing stuff and using multiple machines simultaneously, and that in itself leads to things going wrong, because it's really hard to keep cutting and pasting between the same place and getting that process without the automation that Matt will talk about a bit later. So lots of things that can go wrong, never mind just the cost and the slowing down of being able to deliver that service.
I guess when you need a management tool to manage your management tools, you're doing something wrong.
And that's probably the situation that many larger companies have been in for a long time now.
I mean, is this just something that kind of creeps up on you, this kind of tools?
Yep.
It is, because people in the business will say, well, I need more information. So you get another tool. I need more information. You get another tool. And then when you have lots and lots of information, the question you tend not to ask is, well, what does it all mean? Because it's all about interpretation. You could do that with 1 tool or 59 tools, and people don't do that. So you buy 1 tool, the user says, well, that's not giving me the right information, so let's get another tool. It's like in my organisation speaking to users and saying, did you know we have 99.99% uptime on systems? And 9 people out of 10 will say, well, what does that mean when I couldn't access email on Friday?
Yep.
So it doesn't. It's irrelevant information then, because you've got a tool that reports it, and you might display it on a dashboard, They'll say it's irrelevant to them because they couldn't get on a particular system. So then you say, well, let me give you a different report, which is the uptime of email. But the question fundamentally remains the same. I couldn't get on my email.
The flip side of that as well is, I know from the days when I'd stopped being a real IT manager and actually worked on the dark side as a guy trying to promote service level monitoring and in user response time monitoring tools. We talked to lots of organisations where the users would say not so much that the email wasn't working on Friday afternoon, but frankly that every morning between 8 o'clock, particularly Monday mornings between 8 o'clock and 10 o'clock, the systems were running so slowly that we couldn't use it anyway, so we went off and did something else. Now, as far as our monitoring tools were concerned, it was up and available, but it was available at such a speed that nobody could use it. And so therefore that also generates lots of bad feeling on the part of the users that IT just isn't delivering. So you've got to make sure that you are monitoring the right things and understanding what they mean to the end users, and that interpretation is something that's not always there because we rely sometimes too much on the wrong numbers. Same way that I said earlier, we have the wrong service level agreements in place in the first instance because that's what was easy to measure. Might not be the thing that we should be measuring, but that's what we measured.
You'll notice how quiet Matt's keeping, which I think is a remarkable achievement given that we're talking about tools now. But I'm not going to let you talk up now either, Matt, because we're going to come back to Kaseya. But right now, I think it's worth going in doing the deep dive into how you got on in your organisation, Dr. Zafar, with implementing some of this stuff. So shall I hand you control of the mouse?
Yes, please.
I hand him control of the mouse, and we'll take through who we are from the NHS Trust perspective.
So in terms of our organisation, so we're a women's hospital and a children's hospital, and we're turning over about 275 million, about 6 million of that spent on IT. But most importantly, what is our user base? So our user base, we've got 4,000 employees across 2 hospitals. We're up to 40 satellite sites now, and we are supporting about 5,000 desktops with 600 laptops. We have community-based working. Some people come back to base, some people don't come back to base. So it's a variety of people that we're servicing. In terms of what is an NHS trust, we are a foundation trust. We run as an independent business. If we do what we say we do, we get paid for that. If we don't, we don't. We get ratings for excellence. And we as an IT team within these organisations have spent a lot of time focusing on standards, best practice, but not to the letter. So we have ISO certifications and a variety of things to help us along the way. When you look at challenges within our environment per se, well, for every business, costs are increasing. The comprehensive spending review that the government recently announced as the government changed meant for us in health and health IT, we had to reduce our costs by about 10%. Year on year, whilst being told that service levels should improve at the same time. So you're losing people, you need to be able to automate more, so therefore that's where the tools sort of drop in, but you start off in a position where you don't truly know if your processes are right as well. So you've got 2 challenges in a very short time to change, and as in any organisation, the health has been sort of struggling through this. Change management is a major problem, getting people to change so quickly.
And it's not as if you can sort of say, can everyone just hold off for 2 weeks just while we have a think about this and maybe try a few things out,
You'd love to be able to turn
it around a bit.
The systems off, configure them and start again, but nobody lets you do that in a changing pace. We're finding that the technology is becoming more complex, so we're struggling to keep staff trained to the levels that they need to do. You're putting in new technologies, be it data center technologies, be it front end, and even the next generation of laptop, tablet, etc. That's harder and harder to sort of manage. So expectations are exponentially increasing. People want better service levels. They obviously want all the reporting and the service levels, but at the same time, because it's health, you always have to look at information governance, security, right? Security is always a big issue. So when we embarked on our journey to transform ourselves as a service delivery team, as I said, it was about people. So we looked to see whether or not the the staffing levels we had, the skill sets we had were best placed for what we wanted to deliver? What were the processes we were following? And were we following our own processes internally as well? And we weren't. So, ordering a piece of equipment could be 4 pieces of paper that circulated through the organisation and could result in you getting a laptop in 4 weeks. So you're like, really? When we all know that in today's web world you can order something and it just shows up next business day. But we weren't that service, so we had to take a look at what we were doing. We were doing a lot of rework, we needed to decrease that, and of course everybody in every organisation always looks at IT as a pain. They always say, you need to do it better, you need to do it lower, and how can you demonstrate that you are saying what you do?
Yes.
Okay. So we started with an approach where you can't do this without senior management buying in. So IT management and management higher than that at board level had to set the tone. We are going to change. And the health service itself has to change.
Were they up for that? Were they kind of bought in from the start, or was it?
Executive level buy-in was there.
Right.
Ground level buy-in wasn't. So the staff on the ground are more than happy to do the 9 to 5, day to day. Why should we change if we can't pay our bills? Why should we change? Whereas the executives know that it's a business. You have to be able to pay your bills. So there was lots of support from there. We did a lot of communication with staff. Some staff were buying into the change, some weren't. Because it's a proper project, we probably haven't been traditionally very good at project managing things like this. Because the longer the project, I always say that if a project lasts longer than 6 months, people lose interest in it anyway. Mm-hmm. So if you've not got a tight grip on how that project goes, that's a problem. And I always say, well, if you really want IT to work, you've got to keep it really simple. So simple internally within your own teams and simple externally. Because complex processes confuse people, and our own people get confused at the same time. We're no different. And my approach has always been, in this project and others, is, well, it's all about common sense. But common sense isn't common. And you see that all the time within your own teams and externally. But if you look at return on investment on changing your service delivery provision, for example, if people are calling service desk and getting their passwords reset, which seems to be a major issue in most organisations, if you have got tools that can automate some of the functionality, if you're doing some portion of ITIL, in this case incident management, after a month or two of working in a slightly different way, you're very quickly going to realise, well, actually password changes are the biggest problem in most organisations. And if you can shave down the time you spend with users on calls, you can reduce your staffing levels. And this slide was just an example of, if you could save a minute per call in a day across 4,000 users, there is a potential to make a huge amounts of savings. In our project, whilst implementing change, bringing in new automated tools like Kaseya, we found that we've been able to reduce staffing levels. So we use a lot less staff, 25% less staff than we used to do the same tasks. Yet service levels have actually been set in stone and actually are being delivered, whereas before with more staff we weren't actually delivering those service levels. So I think for any size of organisation you can absolutely achieve that, but it's an evolution, not a revolution. And I think the challenge with public sector right now is we're trying to do a revolution. Mm-hmm. And if we don't slow down, we're going to find that it looks great on a baseline, but you've got to bring everybody with you.
Yep.
But how can you bring everybody with you if you're going to be laying off 25% of them? I guess there's a...
Well, that's where you have to combine the good people that you're keeping with some of the automated tools. So you've got to take your vendor partners and actually push them to the limit. Because I sit through a lot of presentations with a lot of vendors, a lot of laptop presentations showing me how I can save the world. And I always take the approach that, well, actually, if it really does what you say it does, prove it to me. A simple analogy which we used with our friends at Kaseya probably 5 years ago to say, well, this is great on a laptop demo, but can you really implement things like self-service? Can you get users to look at this tool and say, is it something we can use? And people sort of associate themselves with things that they're familiar with. So when you look at your desktop, for instance, when we deployed Kaseya, in the right-hand corner it was the K, and our communications plan was look for the K. If you've got the K, that means you're protected. And over time, when people don't have the K, they complain. So you sort of get a mindset, even though they don't really know what the software or the technology is, you've embedded in their minds that their PC, their laptop, is working well because the K is there and is functioning. And if you right-click the K, there's information there that will help us to help you. Because the previous problem we had was when you're trying to fix somebody's problem, you didn't actually know what equipment they were on. So now you actually have that information, but not information you're collecting. They're participating in their actual problem. And you will see people changing in the environment. So we're seeing the next generation of doctor who doesn't want us to service them. They want to service themselves because they come from that world. And tools like this, and others as well, are helping us do this. But you do have to be very careful of tool creep, right? You can have 59 tools and people not wrap their heads around it.
What I'm taking from this is there is always the opportunity to do stuff better. I mean, I know that sounds like bleeding obvious, sorry. It's time for some bleeding obvious statements here. We can do this better, we can do it cheaper, we can do it by handing control over to the users, but at the same time they need to feel confident that they're in control in some way, and hence the K thing. And equally, we can make ourselves more proactive, potentially with less staff, but sorry, but that's what IT is for. And we can be making ourselves more proactive, more flexible, etc., etc. So you're trying to balance and get the best of both of those things: more flexible IT, more proactive users, without selling the farm and ending up with tool creep and all those horrible things that could go with it.
Absolutely.
So,
but if you're looking at an environment where you think that we will ever have enough IT staff, I don't think that exists in any business. Well, that comes
back to what you were saying before, which is that there's always far more to do than there is people to do it. So.
And tools like this give you even more information that you probably didn't want to know. That's the other challenge, right? So when you start this journey and you're trying to be a service provider with your own organisation, you look at that and you say, well, I don't really know that much about what's going on. Then tools tell you about what's going on, and then you sit in a room thinking, well, I'm not sure I really wanted to know. Because once you know, you have to do something about it, right? Yeah. When we first deployed the tool, we didn't actually know that we had 5,000 desktops connected to the network. We thought we just had a 1-to-1 ratio of 4,000. So another 1,000 appeared, and we're like, oh, great. So does that mean we've actually been updating those in line with all the other 4,000? The answer was no. So then we have to have a remedial action plan to say, well, there must be 1,000 desktops out there with users on them who probably aren't extremely happy about what that desktop is doing, if it's turning on at all. And that was the analogy of, you can have a system that says systems are up, but how do you actually measure that the system is fast enough for what the users want?
Just got random screensavers in the corners.
So and people had stopped using a large percentage of those 1,000 PCs when we investigated, because they were 9 years old, some of them. So people were like, well, they're pointless, because when they boot up, you could literally go and have lunch and come back and it wouldn't have connected to the network. So it then allowed us to be more proactive as well.
And that's a classic problem, that people really don't know what kit they have. Talked about it earlier. It's still the case in most organisations that people think they know what they have, but the reality is different. Archetypal asset management.
So, Matt, your moment in the spotlight then. Tell us, what does Kaseya bring to the party then?
Well, I mean, Kaseya at least brings all of those point solutions that we've been discussing today, and allows you to have them all in one sort of single pane of glass, one web based console. You can then start managing those devices proactively. So you can start, monitoring for issues like low disk space and various other bits and pieces within the mix. Be alerted to that fact and also remediate from that fact. You'll see here the way that we're now moving is that we've got dynamic policies within Kaseya that basically allow you to say, well, this is a Windows 7 machine. Once the Blue K or whatever agent you want to put on the machine communicates back to your Kaseya server, it automatically takes on that persona. So automatically, all of that monitoring and configuration, which is the investment from the services point of view up front, is then deployed down to the machine very easily and very quickly and seamlessly.
Are we talking desktop management, server management?
It doesn't really matter. It's across the board, really, in that case. I mean, when we say manage almost any device on that slide you see there, we've now just released agents that go onto your iPads, your iPhones, your Android devices as well. So we can start tracking those devices and managing those devices with Kaseya. Mm-hmm. But the whole key for today is to start building up, that service delivery, the automation, as I spoke about earlier on, about sort of, setting things up in Kaseya just to work on a scheduled basis in the background, set and forget, your backups, various other bits and pieces, and you just know that they are working. Of course, if there are any problems, you're also monitoring for those problems, and you're able to take remedial action. It's a point that Zafar brought up earlier on about these machines out there that we don't know what state they're in. If you've got agents out there on these machines, you can then start doing sort of patch management across the board. You just know that all the machines on your network are now up to the same level of patching because you've brought them all in-house to this single pane of glass.
I guess the debate is, maybe for you, Dr. Zafar, is how important is it to have a console onto your infrastructure versus a set of different access points onto your infrastructure, one for servers, one for backups, etc., to be able to see everything within a single pane of glass?
I think as you're shrinking your teams, it becomes more and more important.
Right.
Because training is an issue. So if you've got 14 panes of glass into your environment, 14 training sessions. If you've got one where centrally you can go, and this is also not only from an IT perspective, but from an executive perspective as well, because I use the tool myself, but I use my dashboard for just reporting. When somebody comes to me and says, well, have you complied with all the software that you've bought, and you've got all the licensing, I can run a report because it's a very simple to use interface to give me that level of assurance. Or somebody says, are you running our software without licensing? So I think it's good, it's the right thing to do to consolidate and simplify your environment. Use tools that you're comfortable with, but don't use lots and lots of them. Because even with a tool like Kaseya, every year when we talk to our partners at Kaseya, we realise, well, there's some things we didn't know the tool did, and can we now get remedial training to do it? Because they keep on adding modules, which are included, which is great for the staff, but we have to keep up with them. The newest one being like mobile device management. That's a big thing now. People want to bring their devices to work. They've added a module, they've told us about it, and now we're testing it. But then that means the staff go through another cycle of learning something new. But at least the login, the user interface, the basic functionality of the tool stays the same. So you save time and money by having that single pane.
And it's something that's come up again in survey after survey that we've carried out, where the readers tell us that, do they want even more functionality? Well, there are times when they do. Or would they prefer that the tools that they have to actually work better together so that they can, spend less time actually doing stuff? And that's always, even higher than giving us more functionality, unless it's in a really crucial area that we've got nothing in today. And it ties in to a degree with this whole question of automation. If we'd asked the audience out there, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, are you ready to accept a tool automating these routine processes for you? Most people have said, well, I still want to say yes, yes, do it at the end of it, because I'm not confident and comfortable that the technology can actually do the automation that is promised on the tin. And I think that that's certainly gone away to a large degree now. Certainly for the routine automation of tasks that are just labour intensive, that frankly no one enjoys doing, but they have to do them.
I guess
that's changed dramatically.
There's two aspects then. The first, which I'll click through to the next slide, as I say it, is about what you're saying here. It's about that balance between, take the mobile device management example. Are we helping people to learn a mobile device management tool, or are we helping people to manage mobile devices?
Exactly.
Ultimately, it's the same thing, but you can't have one without the other. So to have a single starting point for that sort of simplifies the training, because you're starting with the same console and it's a plug-in. So it's like starting with the same training and it's a plug-in to what they know already. But then the second aspect then is the automation and being able to take away the pain.
Definitely. And I just want to go back to one of Tony's points earlier on, where he said, if you've got these point solutions, there is sort of a margin for error. Whereas if you've got all of these together in one place, it means that all the modules know, you've got your auditing, which feeds into your remote control. You know it's that machine. You've got that baseline, if you like. When you start getting into the automation, for example, the slides you've got up here, backups are one of those things that seem to take forever, and there's so many things that can sort of scupper a backup. The tape's not in the drive, the tape's not rewound, all these very, very straightforward things that if they're not there, well, the backup's failed, and if the backup fails, that's then a big problem for the business. And so, one of the customers that we were talking to with this particular slide, has written kind of some automation scripting within Kaseya that goes out and checks to see if the tape's in the drive. If there is a tape in the drive, lovely, you make sure it's rewound, ready, it will run the backup. There's no tape in the drive, it will raise some sort of alert, an email, send out to whoever needs to know to say, hey, go put a tape in the drive and make sure this is set up. And of course, if it fails after that, then it has to be escalated that, well, there wasn't a tape in the drive, so as much as IT's responsible, if...
Who's the silly person?
It goes back to sort of, we can only do so much with what we've got, but at least we can give you everything. We can get visibility of all these issues.
So you don't solve all the problems, then? I'm gutted.
Well, yeah, I mean, as one of our other MSPs says, Kaseya is not a silver bullet. It's not. You don't put the software in and everything goes away. You've still got to have your standards. You've still got to have your processes, but it does give you the flexibility to know more. As Zafar's pointed out already, you find a lot more information, maybe more than you would want to know, but at least it provides you with that sort of insight to what's going on.
I've got three questions here that I'm going to try build into one. The first is, what should we get first? Should it be the process or should it be the tool? Because clearly the tool is going to enforce some kind of process.
The people.
Ooh, he's good, isn't he?
Yeah. You have to get the people, you have to get the people right within your organisation.
Yep.
And depending on whether you're private or public sector, in my sector, it is very difficult to do that. There's lots of process you have to go through to get the right people in place, but without the people with the right mindsets who truly believe in what needs to be done to transform from who they are to being service providers, it doesn't matter how many processes you define. There'll be too many roadblocks. So I would say people. Very good,
very good. And to take that forward, with process, with tools and so on and so forth, what about scheduled outages? I guess it's moving into more of the proactive state where you actually want to have advance warning of things going down, or system replacement, change programs.
Yeah, and Kaseya can obviously you can build a lot of that process in. Effectively you can be alerted to immediate downtime, but if you're doing maintenance downtime, then obviously you can take that into account as well. Because the one thing you don't want is your monitoring and remediation tool starting to throw loads of alarms because you've taken down your Exchange server, because you're doing some routine maintenance. So it's about making that part of the process as well.
And most end users understand the need for routine maintenance, and it's always planned in so that very few people are caught unawares when it happens. And if the service itself is crucial enough, then you basically run it somewhere else anyway, so that the users never realise that something's down. But getting the change management in place so that you can actually program things in is something that as Dr. Chaudry said right at the beginning, something that needs to be addressed, because organisations want things to change much more quickly. And part of the inhibitor to that is actually making sure that when you make the changes that they are risk-free or as risk-free as possible. And that's not just on the IT side that the change management process needs to change, but also getting the business, who will be involved in the change management process, to speed up as well.
And should that be built into the SLAs, or is that a step too far? Are we, when we're able to say yes, we will guarantee?
Well, yeah, I think it maybe is stretching the boundaries a little bit, but in some cases, some of that routine maintenance can actually automate it into the process that you've got. I mean, taking a cue from some of our MSPs, they actually sort of say part of the routine maintenance is they're going to schedule up once a week a disk defrag, a check disk, of all your workstations, so that you don't start getting those white noise emails that, my machine's just running a little bit slower than it used to. So it's about not only using the SLAs for what they're for, but also bringing down the amount of required remediation because you're proactively maintaining these devices.
And it is worthwhile pointing out that not all service providers are equal either. There are some service providers still that have planned outage times during key business hours for email systems, which is just plain crazy. So not all service providers are equal, in the same way that not all IT departments are at the same level of their development and evolution.
It's live confession time. We used to do scheduled backups 10 o'clock on a Monday morning. I'm sorry. I learned. But speaking of lessons, Dr. Chaudry, do not start by purchasing a tool. This is one of your points here.
Absolutely.
Where do you think? I mean, I don't want to read off the slide, but where do you think people should start then, if just getting the silver bullet isn't the answer?
I say you start a parallel program of redefining your people's roles as well as looking at your processes. What you will find from that process is change management is difficult. You need to have a change champion. You need executive level sponsorship in this process. And whilst you're doing that, you can start evaluating any tools that will help you. Mm-hmm. At the end of that process, sorting out your people and your processes, then you would be in a position to have already evaluated the market and start implementing tools. I would say that any vendor that tries to bring a tool to you, you must challenge the vendor with a test of their technology first. Because if they say they can do it, and it's great on the laptop, I'm not sure you can always believe it till you test it within your own environment.
So, I mean, this is getting into the common sense, isn't that common kind of territory, isn't it? So, you need a big stick for the vendors.
You do, and I think when you're buying tools from anybody, it's about building partnerships with that vendor, because you will have problems in deployments of projects. If you maintain a good relationship with that vendor, they will work very hard to help that happen. You have to make sure that the partner you select has the buy-in to your project as well, because it's not always about their selling software licenses. Do they really want to support you in this journey? So you have to take a look at that, and you can get that through talking to other customers they have, or looking at analyst reports about that particular company. It's very useful. You really do need to find out what equipment you have in your enterprise. We found lots of stuff we didn't know we had.
Yep.
Stakeholders, well, your users, you have to communicate with them in terms of what you're doing. Even though they'll never probably see this tool, you have to find a hook in which they can participate in the process. And showing people, and we did this in our organisation, showing people demonstrations of a tool which they probably will never use is quite interesting in terms of some of the comments you get, where people are like, can you really see my desktop from afar? Really? Can you take control of it? No, really? Do you know what I'm doing on my desktop? Yes, we do. So it opens up a whole new world to the user as well.
So we're on the hour, and I think these are some of the lessons. I mean, I was so impressed. I think that the word stakeholders really jumped out there. It's that kind of engagement and having conversations, and this technology process people think has been the threads right the way through. But I just ask, have you got any last thoughts? the good doctor first, and then maybe we'll just go to Matt and to Tony as final thoughts on this whole area.
My final thoughts on it is it's a journey. It takes time. Be careful how you project manage it, and you must keep it very tight and succinct. This cannot be an 18-month journey. You will lose people at 6.
Okay, good point.
I think from my perspective, it's make sure that you've got a defined plan, because we touched on the surface today, Kaseya can do quite a lot for you, and you want to make sure that if you are going to go down this journey with Kaseya or any other tool, that at least you know what you're trying to achieve, because otherwise you can get very lost in, well, what can I do? What do you want to do? Kind of logic. So it's about knowing not necessarily the end game, but the journey you want to take to make sure you can map that into the tool you need.
Have a plan.
Definitely have a plan.
Tony?
All comes down to that understanding, what have I got? What are my main pain points? I'm getting lots of noise, but which are the ones that are really important for the business that we fix first? So that, again, you keep it focused on where to begin. Don't try and boil the ocean. And communicate. Yeah, couldn't have made the point better myself.
Okay. Well, thank you very much to our panellists. If you have any further questions, apologies if we didn't answer all the questions this morning. Do please get in touch in the comments field on the Register website. Further readings up on the slide now, and the presentation will appear in an archived version probably in the next 48 hours or so. So please do listen again, watch again, and show your friends. And good luck with all of your service management needs. Thank you very much.